Welcome to the Amateur Diaries podcast, the podcast that dives into the latest research on exercise and diet to provide you, the listener, with some clarity on an ever more confusing statements coming from various media outlets. So if that sounds interesting to you, why not give this podcast a listen? I must stress that anything said in this podcast does not substitute the advice of a medical professional. Listeners are advised to seek professional medical advice before acting upon anything learned during any of these episodes. And with that, let's dive into the initial episode on the vegan diet. So I think it's important to first provide information on my background with the vegan diet, just so we can understand any biases that I may have. I have done a fully vegan diet twice in my life. The first time was 2018. I did that for 9 weeks. I would say I gave it a valiant effort, but I was in a stage where I was trying to bulk as a rugby player. I weighed about 105 kilos, measured 189 centimeters, and simply getting 230-ish grams of protein in a day without multiple protein shakes in a day was simply too challenging, and I ended up dropping off the meal. Then in 2021, I took the diet on again, and this lasted, I'd say, fairly rigidly for a year before slight alterations were made. More meat was added back into my diet, but I still remain relatively plant-based in comparison to my previous meat intakes. I'd say I've gone down to about 100 grams a day, probably 6 days a week, in comparison to 250 grams to 500 grams a day, 7 days a week. So that's kind of my biases. I have tried the diet before. I do not follow it rigidly anymore, but I have got reasonable experience around it personally. So I think ever since 2018, the vegan diet has been aware to pretty much everybody who watches Netflix. That was when the Game Changers came out. Before that point, at least as a rugby player myself, in the changing rooms before that point, I'd say vegetarians, were mentioned somewhat regularly, but only in reference to someone they knew. But after 2018 and the release of the Game Changers, I'd say 20% of people were either giving the diet a go, knew someone, were discussing it regularly, and it had become a fairly common topic. So in the media, the plant-based diets, so that includes a vegan diet, provide a well-established physical and environmental health benefits, can I stress, in the media. These benefits mainly stem in part from the degree of restriction of the animal-derived foods. So, in theory, the more restriction there is, the better the outcome. Historically, meat and other animal-derived proteins have been viewed as kind of an integral part or an integral component of an athlete's diet, leading to a lot of questions from people on the other side of the fence as to the adequacy of a vegetarian or vegan diet for supporting athletic performance, which for me personally is a key part of my life, athletic performance. I've transitioned to cycling rather than rugby, but still athletic performance being a key part for me and probably a lot of people. So based on current available literature, it's unlikely that plant-based diets provide an advantage, but also do not suffer from disadvantages. These are all early kind of statements, so we'll build upon all of them, but when they're compared to an omnivorous diet for strength and anaerobic and aerobic exercise performance, there doesn't seem to be advantages or disadvantages following plant-based diets. What we will come to talk on is usually over a short period of time, so this can be like 8 to 10 weeks following a program. So any of the long-term side effects of restricting animal products won't really be seen in this time frame. The next key point is really plant-based diets have been seen to typically reduce the risk of developing numerous chronic diseases over the lifespan of an individual, and require fewer natural resources for production compared to meat-containing diets. So that's the environmental impact that often is spoken about. So as such, plant-based diets appear to be a viable option for adequately supporting athletic performance, seeing as there is no downside to them, apparently. So contributing overall physical and environmental health, so the environment around you and then your physical health. The only thing is, given the sparse literature comparing omnivore and vegetarian and vegan athletes, particularly at the elite level, further research is warranted to gain certainties around this and whether athletic performance is actually impaired or not. Now, this is where it kind of is the key word here: observational. So observational data shows that vegetarians tend to have better cardiovascular outcomes compared to those consuming omnivorous diets, and so that's a key thing that was, I guess, mentioned in the game changers, is the fact that cardiac outcomes are better. So that includes the risk of morbidity and mortality. That includes the risk of morbidity and mortality from heart disease, a reduced incidences of cancer, decreased risk in developing type 2 diabetes, decreased risk of developing metabolic syndrome, lower all-cause mortality, and these positive health outcomes likely relate to the lower body mass index. This is what was suggested. The lower glucose levels, the lower systolic and diastolic pressure, lower total low density lipoprotein cholesterol. So that's your LDL-C that you'll see on often on your blood work if you've ever gone to the hospital and had a blood panel taken. So you've also got lower triglycerides, and all these kind of factors are all these key things that you'll hear usually, I suppose, if you go to a doctor with some kind of health issue in there, or you're getting a checkup and they say, oh yeah, your LDL-C might be a little high, your blood pressure may be a little high. And so what is being suggested is, following these plant-based diets, that these issues could be resolved. Now, although that's from observational data, it is suggested that experimental data or experimental studies, kind of in the short term, seem to show similar results. As I said, observational data, you've really got to be kind of careful with these. So the main problem with observational studies is the presence of confounders and selection bias. A confounder can be defined as any factor that is related not only to the intervention, so the treatment that's been provided, but also the outcome, and could affect and it could affect both at the same time. So a good example to kind of understand how this works is age. So in a study on the relationship between smoking, or smoking exposure, and lung cancer. So smoking being the thing you're exposed to, like, for example, like a training stimulus could be the thing you are exposed to, and lung cancer being the outcome, so the effect, and then in sport it'd be the positive training adaptation. Age could be implicated as a factor that would increase the incidence of the outcome. Thus, like if one of the groups, say the smokers or non-smokers, were an older population, the increase in lung cancer could be influenced by that age, and that would be the co-founder. So if you were a group of people doing a study and you wanted to prove that an omnivorous diet or a plant-based diet was more advantageous, you could, seeing as you're only doing observational data, purposely select a group of individuals with conditions or age or sex or whatever it is that tie in to give your desired outcome, irrelevant to the actual what the difference is, like their diet. You'd also have to be aware that advanced statistical tools now exist, and they can provide a good and reliable control over many of these co-founders. So if the people doing the study truly are doing a proper scientific study, they can use some of these tools and correct for things like age and sex and pre-existing conditions and diet and things like this. But there is no kind of substitute really for doing a controlled randomized study. So it's probably a good point to say that not everyone following a plant-based diet or a vegan diet is doing it solely for the health benefits. And some people, it can be an ethical thing. They can just simply, I suppose, not agree with the way animals are treated or the death of an animal for their own kind of self-preservation. Now, that is something that can't really be debated. It's up to the individual as to whether they agree with it or not. Now, a little fact about the sustainability that I came across while looking through all of this. So apparently phosphorus is a common fertilizer used. Well, it's used in the part of the fertilizer for food production. And obviously it's limited. And in theory, if we continue on the way we're going, it will be depleted within 50 to 100 years. Now, although a plant-based diet would not mean we would never deplete it, but it would reduce the rate at which we do, and then suppose give scientists more time to come up with an alternative to that even. But the aim of this episode is not really to talk about the environmental impacts and the ethical impacts. It's mainly the nutritional side of things. So on to the nutritional intake. So this is where it gets a little bit kind of, I don't know, evidence contradicts itself at times and then corrects itself, and then it's all a bit kind of here, there and everywhere. So data indicates that omnivores consume more total energy, saturated fat, cholesterol, sodium and protein, but less fiber, calcium and iron than vegetarians. And then vegans consume the least energy, saturated fat, sodium and calcium, but the most fiber and iron. And then, so that was observational. Other studies with smaller sample sizes largely substantiated these observations. And in spite of that higher iron content in their diet, typically vegans and vegetarians have a lower serum ferritin, which is your iron stores, than omnivores or just meat eaters in general. And then this is placed on the fact that there is a lower bioavailability of the type of iron found in plants. Well, the reduced bioavailability of the type of iron that is found in plants. And that just means that if you eat 10 grams of, I mean, these numbers are completely made up, but say you eat 10 grams of iron of animal protein, say you get 5 grams out of that 10. If you had the same 10 grams but out of a plant-based substitute, you may only get 3 or 2 grams. So it just means for your body it's harder / isn't able to absorb as much of that. So even though you're eating more iron overall, your body is struggling to take that iron and use it. So as high iron stores may be the risk factor for developing some chronic diseases, it can be seen as a good thing that your iron stores are lower. But it's important that a fine balance needs to be struck to optimize oxygen carrying capacity of the blood while avoiding the risk of non-communicable diseases. And because low iron stores can result in iron deficiency anemia, which can be problematic for athletic performance. In particular, endurance events, as iron plays a critical role in oxygen carrying capacity. Now, if you're, a weightlifter, right, and really your oxygen carrying capacity doesn't matter too much, you're really just doing stuff anaerobically, really. Whether you're capable of, have a high VO2 max doesn't really matter too much. But if you're looking to do a 5k, a 10k, a half marathon, a marathon, an Ironman, a half Ironman, a sprint triathlon, a road race on a bike, a mountain bike race, anything really that lasts more than 10 seconds, this is critical that your iron or your iron stores are optimized if you want to achieve that higher athletic performance. The vegan diet, though, is generally rich in carbohydrates, omega-6 fatty acids, dietary fibers, carotenoids, folic acid, vitamin C, vitamin E, and magnesium, but tends to be relatively low in proteins, omega-3 fatty acids, vitamin B12, vitamin D, calcium, iron, zinc, and iodine, which obviously are all pretty critical, and we'll go into some of these. So vitamin B12, that's one of the things that I suppose now, well, first of all, I think if you go to someone and you say you're vegan, or you meet someone who's vegan and the other person knows anything about diet, they're probably going to go, how do you get your B12 or whatever? Because numerous studies have focused and put attention on the possible deficiency of vitamin B12 in vegans, as it's contained in food like meat, eggs, fish, milk, cheese, all animal products. So if you're eliminating them, where are you getting your vitamin B12 from? It's an essential micronutrient, so you need this micronutrient, and it's involved in numerous biomechanical activities such as maturation of red blood cells, the function of the nervous system, the biosynthesis of neurotransmitters, signs and symptoms that you are vitamin B12 deficient are pretty well known. They include things like fatigue, wheezing, lack of energy, headache, irritability, possible anemia. Now that anemia kind of translates to the fact that the maturation of red blood cells is reduced. So it just means you are not producing these red blood cells that are able to carry oxygen. So you're going to suffer from all these fatigue associated issues because you just simply can't transport oxygen around your body. Depression is also on that list, sleep disorders, and just other general impairments. So just all things you just don't really want to have. The interesting thing, now I assumed, if you went, and I think a lot of people who start doing the vegan diet don't supplement vitamin B12 and then kind of go, I've been doing this for 6 months and I've got no problems. So clearly vitamin B12, it's a gimmick. It's a way of someone making more money. But in fact, vitamin B12 deficiencies can occur in both vegetarians and vegans. So it's not that if you're a bit less restrictive, you can. I mean, if you're a vegetarian, you eat eggs, then I suppose you are less likely. But vitamin B12 can actually be, like, your levels can be buffered by your liver because it has reserves of this, like an adequate amount for several years. And I mean, I assume that the thing is, that's probably going to depend, like anything, on your prior diet. So maybe you had a diet that already was deficient, and so after 6 months you start having problems because you've just sort of got even more radical. But for the most part, like if you've had a fairly balanced diet beforehand, then maybe you'll go a year, maybe you'll go 2 years before you show any of these signs as a result of a B12 deficiency. So it's something to keep in mind, that it probably is important to supplement this or avoid the diet possibly, if these are kind of things you're suffering. I mean, if you're doing any diet and you suddenly start suffering from these kind of things, then, and like headache can be one where maybe it lasts a week and it goes away, but long-term issues like this should be a sign that you shouldn't be doing what you're doing. Now, the next one is protein quality, something that is probably going to be at the forefront of any gym. I'm going to call it a gym bro, but anyone who goes to the gym is looking to build muscle. You're probably quite concerned about your protein intake and then your protein quality. Even cyclists and endurance athletes, you're really going to be like hot on your proteins, and just general day to day having a high protein, reasonably high protein diet is it kind of looks like it's advice. So there are several features that differentiate plant-based proteins from animal proteins, other than the fact that they're coming from a different source. One of them is that you got these indispensable amino acids. So branch chain amino acids, BCAAs, sound probably very familiar to a lot of people who've gone to the gym. Always see those people sipping those multicolored drinks at the gym, usually BCAAs. Now, before I say what I'm going to say, I came in with the idea of, oh, Jesus, for years I've thought BCAAs were kind of useless. Is this going to now tell me otherwise? Because, I don't know, it was always this supplement that you take and it doesn't really have many benefits, but people take it anyway. So BCAAs are particularly important for promoting muscle protein synthesis. One of the big ones is leucine. These amino acids are more concentrated in animal-based proteins compared to plant-based proteins. But it's been shown that, especially in your kind of the protein powders you'll get, that somewhere in the range of like 30 to 35 grams, maybe even a bit less, from a plant-based, these like blends, can be enough to trigger muscle protein synthesis. So digestion and absorption rates also differ in these proteins, and thus impact the potential for muscle protein synthesis. Now, with all this, so the fact that BCAAs are lower concentration, the absorption rate's lower, the way they're digested's different. Studies have actually interestingly shown that interventions where they use, either a whey-based protein, so animal, or soy-based protein, so a plant-based protein, in conjunction with strength training, have typically yielded negligible differences between the groups of lean mass, between the groups for lean mass development. So effectively saying that there are all these differences between these two protein sources, but when we provide them to groups of people and get them to do weight training, the muscle protein synthesis signaling doesn't seem to be any different. So confusing, but essentially if you choose to, veer away from whey because the lactose and you struggle to digest it yourself and you get gassy or whatever, then the evidence is kind of suggesting that you don't need to worry too much. You can buy a vegan protein, not because you're vegan, but because you struggle with whey. The other thing, so I'm going to just put this in there, but remember that there doesn't seem to be any difference in the muscle building capabilities of these two protein groups, but there's apparently a presence of anti-nutritional factors in these plant-based proteins that just affect the digestibility of and how much of it you absorb. But look, if you're getting the maximum trigger out of muscle protein synthesis, then it probably isn't something to worry about. Now, this is then something to be aware of, that the variables that affect dietary protein requirements to optimize this muscle protein synthesis. So I probably should have said muscle protein synthesis is, or MPS, is just the process of building muscle. So you damage them, and then your body kind of, in simple terms, your body sits around, waits a little bit, then it sees this influx in protein, and then goes, oh, okay, I've got the resources to carry on to build this. So it's kind of like the bridge has been broken, the builder's there, but if there's no bricks that arrive, he's not going to do anything. He's just going to let the bridge sit there and crumble. But when the bricks arrive, the protein, he goes, okay, I'm going to build this. So he builds it stronger than it was before, because he knows that the previous bridge design wasn't strong enough. And that's your muscles building itself bigger because it realized, oh, lifting this weight was pretty hard with these small muscles. So the factors that affect how much protein you're gonna need to maximize this are age. So the older you get, the more you're gonna need. Well, I suppose the older you get, if you're 18 going to 25, then no. But if you're 25 going to 40, yes. Physical activity expenditure. So if you've gone on a road 100 miles, man, you need to get some protein in you. If you've gone and ridden 10 minutes down the road, then you don't need to have a recovery drink waiting for you with like 40 grams of protein in it. And your energy balance. This could also affect how much you want, which we go into. So effectively, various organizations, so the American College of Sports Medicine, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, I've written these down just because I couldn't remember them, and the Dietitians of Canada, in a joint position, they said that athletes should consume between 1.2 to 1.7 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. So if you were 80 kilos, that would be anywhere from 96 to 136. And then, as I was saying before, if you are in a deficit, so your energy balance, if you are in a deficit, so you're trying to lose weight at this point, that number is higher and goes all the way up to 2 grams per kilogram. A number probably a lot of people can be quite familiar with, especially if they've done bodybuilding. So 2 grams per kilogram, that would put you at a nice easy number of 160 if you were an 80 kilogram individual. So if you're writing these down, the kind of initial numbers are 1.2 to 1.7 if you're kind of in maintenance or in a kind of bulking phase. If you're trying to lean out, lose some weight, then 2 grams per kilogram of body mass of protein per kg. Young adults, so these are kind of the numbers. So this is quite interesting. The kind of general recommendations are from anywhere from 0.24 grams per kilogram to 0.4. So that is pretty different to the 1.2 and 1.7. So especially if you are an athlete, you need to be really looking at this kind of 1.7 number. If you're doing a lot of training, building a lot of muscle, running a lot of miles, cycling a lot of miles, swimming a lot, that's the kind of number you're going for. I was always kind of this. I read a lot about saying how high protein diets are really beneficial, but then also there's information saying, look, it's bad for your kidneys. And I found some information suggesting that your kidneys only really begin to struggle somewhere in the 5 grams per kilogram of body weight. And that's a big number. I mean, 5 times 8, we're talking what? 45. So 450 grams of protein per day. as an 80 kilogram individual. That's a lot of protein. If you are smashing down 450 grams, if you're putting down 300 grams, that's a lot of protein. So to be putting down 400, the most I think I've ever been doing is 220 to 250, and that was pretty miserable doing that with whole foods. So being in that realm, I think most people who are following a balanced diet of any description don't need to be too concerned with how much protein they're getting on the upper end. If you are there thinking, should I push it to 160 and you're 80 kilos, it's fair to say that if you can hit 160 comfortably, hit it and stay there, especially while you're exercising. So then coming on to exercise performance, muscular adaptations, they can be triggered by exercise and diet. So if you're having an intervention that is eliminating a food group or drastically changing how you eat, then it's fair to say that there could be some implications to your exercise performance. So things change when you're exercising. The mitochondria abundance, the muscular capillary density, hemoglobin concentration. So mitochondria, that's almost like your highways. That is the way this oxygen, this blood is getting to the muscle. The capillaries, again, another kind of, your mitochondria are the smaller, then you got your capillaries, hemoglobin, so again, oxygen carrying capacity, endothelial function, functional heart morphology, so like just your heart in general, and the availability of carbohydrates can affect endurance performance and can significantly be influenced by your diet. Now, based on these factors, a vegan and vegetarian diet possess the potential for advantageous properties for endurance performance, mainly because they tend to be quite high in carbohydrates. Because things like, for example, chickpeas, if you compare a chickpea to a piece of chicken, well, you can see it right there, that when you're trying to get your protein in, you are undoubtedly just getting a lot of carbohydrates in at the same time. So now, properties of the contractile elements, so muscle protein synthesis, the neuromuscular system, and phosphagen availability can affect strength performance and can also be influenced by diet. So your ability to be able to lift heavy things really can be influenced by your diet. Now, the key one here is they also possess characteristics that are not going to provide you with that advantage, and that is the fact that it's harder to get your protein intake in. Doesn't matter how heavy, like how well the signaling is, if you just can't build the muscle to move past that current plateau. So there was a recent, it was 2016, systematic review by Craddock and colleagues that summarized a lot of the literature to date of that point. Around vegetarian diets and strength and anaerobic and aerobic exercise performance. Anaerobic being without oxygen, aerobic being with oxygen. So anaerobic, you're weightlifting; aerobic, you're cycling, you're running, you're swimming. Basically anything over a minute. Well, not even that. 10 seconds, let's say. There's generally no significant difference between groups for their VO2 max, so the maximum amount of oxygen they can uptake for a given amount of body weight. There didn't seem to be any difference when they were tested to exhaustion on various endurance tests. Maximal voluntary contraction or isometric endurance upon adoption of the vegetarian diet also didn't seem to differ. This is all in spite of the differences of the macro and the micronutrient intake between vegetarians and omnivores. as well as some physiological differences such as the lower total body creatine and plasma creatinine among these vegetarians. Exercise performance does not appear to differ between dietary groups across multiple measures and types of activities. That is effectively the statement. I'd say that again. In spite of the differences in the macro and micronutrient intake between vegetarians and omnivores, as well as some of the physiological differences such as the lower total body creatinine and plasma creatinine among vegetarians, exercise performance does not appear to differ between dietary groups across multiple measures and types of activities. So that was from your VO2 max testing, so your aerobic capabilities and your anaerobic capabilities in things like weightlifting. As much of this research has been done with recreational athletes, it is said that more work would have to be done on elite athletes to gain an insight there. But the problem with any kind of dietary intervention is if there's going to be a period where there's uncertainty, say you're at the top level of sport, if you're told this diet may work or may not work in 6 months, well, 6 months is too long for a pro athlete to kind of sit there, twiddle their thumbs and go, can I do this or not? But also at the same time, if there are any pro athletes who have done a diet swap, noticed massive differences in their performance, they're unlikely to come out with these kind of benefits until they've already won everything. So it's kind of a waiting game for the general public. Now, I decided to put this in later than earlier. So I touched on vitamin B12 deficiency. There's also the vitamin D deficiency. And originally I was going to put that further up with the vitamin B12. But because this is has such a large impact on your physical performance, I thought it would fit better here. So studies that knocked down the vitamin D receptor for anyone who knows what this is, C2, C12 mitoblast. So just generally studies done where they reduce the effectiveness of the vitamin D receptor resulted in decreased mitochondrial oxidative capacity, so just the reduced ability for your mitochondria to oxidize the glucose in your bloodstream or the fat, and ATP to production. So both kind of your maximal strength and your aerobic ability is decreased when vitamin D is. So it just means that vitamin D clearly plays a key role in strength and endurance performance. As vegans consume significantly less vitamin D compared to omnivores, this may be one of the things that could affect endurance performance. Recent studies have shown positive association between vitamin D status and endurance performance, but also showed that vitamin D supplementation did not improve exercise performance. So although vitamin D in the body seems to be positive, supplementing it doesn't seem to do anything for this athletic performance. That doesn't mean it doesn't do anything for your health overall, but for athletic performance, slamming a bunch of vitamin D doesn't look like it's going to do you any favors. So vitamin D for endurance exercise performance is still inconsistent, and fields haven't really kind of decided what to say about it. So besides that, the choice of diet also influences the gut microbiome. This is one of the kind of things that people are talking about, and it's widely accepted that the constellation and the variety of the microbiome significantly affects the mechanisms like fat oxidation, carbohydrate and protein fermentation processes, and protein anabolism. So fat oxidation, it's critical for an endurance athlete. You can't rely on sugar all the time for athletic performance over the course of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 hours. So if you've got a healthier gut microbiome and it happens to improve your fat oxidative capacity, then this is going to be key. And then protein for recovery, carbohydrate for those high intensity sessions, this looks like to be positive. Vegans and vegetarian diets possess potentially beneficial properties for the gut microbiome and might therefore influence those mechanisms, which may then affect in the long term exercise performance, which is where these kind of shorter 7 to 10, even shorter studies may be sort of losing on that potential kind of benefits. So then metabolic syndrome, which was also mentioned earlier. It's just a cluster of conditions that occur together, and these increase your risk of heart disease, stroke, and type 2 diabetes. These conditions include increased blood pressure, high blood sugar, excess body fat around the waist, and abnormal cholesterols and triglyceride levels. So these, in theory, are all said to be reduced by the following of a plant-based diet. Again, largely from observational studies. So there could be co-founders in there that mean basically the people who are following these omnivore diets may not be following the healthiest diet in general, and these people following this plant-based diet are following a healthier version of the plant-based diet or vegan diet, and therefore have got a lower chance of metabolic syndrome. So the stuff like that is still quite vague. Obesity. Plant-based diets have been shown to effective in the body weight kind of loss sphere. In particular, reduction of visceral and subfacial fat. So like just visceral, just being that fat around your organs that you really don't want. And then fat in the muscle tissue, which, interestingly enough, if you are an endurance athlete and you're going into an event, say you happen to have a DEXA scan the day before the event, so you check like your intramuscular fat levels. If you actually have, say, a little bit more intramuscular fat, that fat can then be used as an energy source. So in a way, it's kind of beneficial. So as an athlete, it's almost something that you don't, visceral, still really need to be worried about visceral fat. But intramuscular, less so. Obviously, if there's a massive amount, then yes, but small amount isn't going to hurt. And then, so both of these have an impact in glucose homeostasis, which is key to kind of, this whole kind of thing of diabetes, where you kind of need to be avoiding it. And apparently, plant-based diets have been effective kind of reducing that. There are two mechanisms that seem to be involved in the body weight loss associated with the diet. The first mechanism is linked to high fiber content, so I guess satiation, and the second is linked to the increased postprandial energy expenditure, so the energy that comes from digesting things in general. So you just eat food, it's just harder for your body to digest, so you burn more calories digesting it. A low-fat vegan diet followed 14 weeks induced a significant weight loss related to the increased insulin sensitivity by improving glucose cell uptake. This is something that can be achieved really with a good aerobic endurance training, zone 2, not necessarily through the sudden elimination of all animal proteins. So it's kind of one of these things where, again, this information could be taken and kind of spun to tell you that eliminating animal protein. But the data is sort of suggesting that. Blood pressure, which is the key thing, the key variable, that is the reason that my first initial 9-week trial was based around. So high blood pressure is the most important cardiovascular modifiable risk factor, and it accounts for about 50% of all heart and brain like sort of blood trauma, lack of supply events. So dietary patterns play a fundamental role in the prevention and the treatment of hypertension, which is high blood pressure, so like millions of people suffer from it, and and it's considered, I think it has changed recently in the US to 130 millimeters of high hemoglobin and a diastolic pressure over 85. I wouldn't quote me on that. But for the rest of the world, and especially the UK, it's 140 over 90. Either one of those. So even if you're 120 over 95, you are still hypertensive. If you're 142 over 60, you are still hypertensive. So either of those are high, you are considered to have hypertension and should consult. If you test yourself at home and it's 140 something, you should go to the doctors, because I didn't originally, because I was lazy. The onset of this high blood pressure can be delayed and counteracted with adoption of a proper diet through your life. It can be characterized through low SPA intake, high fruit and vegetables intake. The reduced amount of food rich in salt is another thing that's suggested. You can find that in things like the book about how not to die. They hammer home the idea of low salt, and limiting the consumption of alcohol to achieve and maintain over the time the correct kind of body weight and blood pressure. So lipid metabolism, this is something that I suppose for everyone is kind of critical. Athletes, this will be really useful, but you can also achieve it. Again, this is another thing that can be achieved through zone 2 training, so lower kind of endurance training, but apparently a vegan diet study was conducted, and the authors showed that the vegans have a better regulation of lipid metabolism, in a particular that of triglycerides. Vegan diet is more efficient in removing potentially atherogenic residues. So it's this idea that, so basically it's been demonstrated that the vegan diet improves the metabolic pathway, so that just the pathway in your body that triglyceride rich lipoproteins, so a lipid and protein for transporting cholesterol, so the LDL and HDL in the body. So since the removal of the remnant lipoproteins from the circulation is faster in vegans compared to that of omnivores, it's more beneficial because they're not sitting around doing damage. But the actual lipolysis process seems to be equal. So mobilizing the fat stores during fasting and exercise. So it would seem that these damaging LDL and HDL cholesterols that sit around in your blood, those can be removed faster, but the actual lipolysis, so the ability to use that fat as a fuel, isn't any higher as a vegetarian or a vegan. But again, getting those LDL, and so for example, you got LDL-C is lower in vegans according to these studies, and that's where you get the improved cardiovascular health. So glycemia, you got hyper and hypo, so hyper being high blood sugar and hypo being low, but the prevalence of type 2 diabetes appears to be relatively low among the individuals who follow plant-based diets, again subject to who you've selected. Numerous clinical studies have shown the improvement in the glycemic control and in the reduction of cardiovascular disease onset. One kind of good example was a 12-week pilot trial conducted on type 2 diabetes patients who followed a vegan diet, showed a 28% decrease in blood glucose levels compared to a 12% measured in the control group that instead followed a free diet. So that is kind of again, although this on the surface seems fantastic, you've got to kind of bear in mind, say for example, those people following the plant-based diets were kind of in better state in the first place, maybe and they were a healthier, fitter individual in the sense of their like cardiovascular abilities. So maybe they were endurance athletes when they may have been following a poor diet. When they then were put on the vegan diet, the cleaner diet, they responded better than maybe the individuals who also followed an omnivorous diet, a poor omnivorous diet, but weren't endurance trained. Meant that the thing that the stimulus didn't have as great an effect. Now, it states, though, the benefits effects are due to the absence of the animal origin fats and the increased consumption of foods with low glycemic index. Again, there are so many things that affect this. You've got the order at which you eat your food, and the fact that when you group all these foods together anyway, you're kind of mixing glycemic indexes. Like, you never really just eat white rice, or the only time it really happens is things like crisps, where you eat them on their own, and chocolate bars. Whereas when you're eating like white rice versus brown rice, and you're mixing it with like proteins, and you're mixing it with fats, this kind of effect is minimized. So to summarize all of that, it's a bit of a can of worms, to be completely honest. If you're going to eliminate, and that is the key thing, eliminating food groups. Now, understandably, if you have an allergy to something or an individual thing, like say maybe one fruit in particular, one vegetable in particular, it's slightly different to eliminating a whole vast range of items, such as all animal-derived products. If you are not eliminating them, you can kind of not be haphazard, but you can sort of go about things without too much research and just sort of pick and choose and vary things. But if you are going to eliminate food groups, then it's really important to do your research and figure out kind of what foods you need to be eating within that diet, and what foods you're likely going to be supplementing. And especially if you're eliminating animal proteins, you're going to kind of have to, for a period of time, count your protein to ensure that you're getting adequate amounts. The pros and cons aren't as clear as they are laid out in the Game Changers or many of the sort of YouTube and Instagram accounts. It's not that clear. It's not that you eat a plant-based diet for a year and now your bench press PBs are phenomenal. You eat a plant-based diet for 6 months and suddenly your FTP, if you're a cyclist, or your 5k time comes down by like 2 minutes. It's just not as clear cut as that. If you're coming from a highly poor, highly processed diet and you come to a much more well balanced vegan diet, then maybe yes, you may see some of these improvements, but it's really going to take a lot of work, and likely, clearly from this, require supplementation. So that's the end of the episode. If anyone is still here, feel free to stick around, give it a like and a follow on. I'm not sure yet what outlets this is going to be on, but whatever outlet you're on, give it a like, give it a review, give it a comment, or whatever is available. Just do that, and hopefully I'll put something out again when I feel like looking through some more research on another topic. And if there is a topic that you happen to like me talking about, then why don't you just suggest it and I'll have a look into it. But thanks for listening, and goodbye.